The morning Caleb Rourke first noticed her, the prairie lay quiet as a held breath, frost still clinging to the grass like forgotten prayers. His cabin stood alone against the pale horizon, wood darkened by years of wind and regret, and he was mending a saddle strap when he saw her walking toward him with a steady calm that felt out of place in a land built on taking. She carried a small basket against her hip, eyes lowered but not afraid, and before he could stop himself, he felt the old instinct rise, to keep the world at a distance, just as he always had, and he wondered why this simple sight unsettled him so deeply. She stopped a few paces from the porch, close enough for him to see the fine dust on her boots and the careful way her hands held the basket, as though it carried more than dried meat and wool. Caleb's voice came out rough, shaped by long silences and harder winters, telling her to leave the sweater once it was mended and go, nothing more. Ayanna Red Willow did not argue or bow her head. She only nodded, as if she had expected no other welcome from a man who lived alone on the edge of town, and in that quiet acceptance, something unseen shifted between them. Ayanna had learned long ago that survival did not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it came stitch by stitch, day after day, in the soft rasp of yarn pulled through tired fingers. Her mother, Maeve Red Willow, had taught her that when Ayanna was still small enough to curl beside the fire, listening to stories of a childhood cut short when a drunken father vanished into the dust. Maeve never spoke with bitterness, only with a resolve that shaped their small cabin and the crocheted sweaters she traded for flour and salt, and as illness crept into her bones, she passed that quiet strength to her daughter, hoping it would be enough. By the time Ayanna began walking the long path to Caleb's cabin, Maeve's hands trembled too much to hold the hook for long. Ayanna took up the work without complaint, her fingers learning the language of loops and knots as naturally as breath, and she carried the sweaters to those who would trade fairly, even if they never spoke her name. The people in town saw only a native girl and her sick mother living at the margins, but Ayanna felt the weight of her mother's gaze, urging her to stand straight and never beg, even when the cold pressed close. Caleb watched her mend the sweater on his porch, her movements unhurried, almost reverent, as though the frayed wool deserved care simply because it existed. He told himself he did not need to know her story, that kindness was a currency he could not afford, yet he found his eyes returning to the way she worked, to the quiet patience that seemed to soften the air around her. When she finished, she set the sweater down neatly and turned to leave without waiting for thanks, leaving him alone with a warmth he had not earned and did not know how to refuse. Days passed, marked by the rhythm of chores and the unspoken anticipation of her footsteps. Each time she came, Caleb said little more than before, and each time she left, he felt the cabin grow larger and emptier, as though it resented his silence. He noticed small things he had trained himself to ignore, the redness of her hands in the cold, the faint weariness behind her eyes, and he wondered what kind of life taught someone to give without asking, a question that lingered longer than he cared to admit. Then one morning she did not come. The prairie remained empty, the horizon unbroken, and the torn sleeve of his sweater lay where he had left it, unmended and accusing. Caleb told himself it was nothing, that people like him were better off unconnected, but the day stretched thin, and with it came a restlessness that drove him from his cabin toward the smaller one near the cottonwoods, where he had never been invited and had never dared to go. Maeve Red Willow lay on her bed when he arrived, her breath shallow but her eyes clear, and Ayanna rose in surprise that quickly softened into something like understanding. The cabin was poor but clean, warmed by a fire that had been carefully fed, and Caleb felt a shame he could not name settle into his chest as he stood there with his hat in his hands. Maeve spoke to him as if he were already known, thanking him for coming, and told him that her daughter mended more than wool, a truth that left him unable to look away. When Caleb met Ayanna's eyes then, he saw not need or expectation, but a steady affection shaped by duty and love, and it undid him in ways no hardship ever had. He realized how often he had mistaken distance for strength, and how easily he had dismissed the quiet labor that kept others alive. Without promising anything he could not give, he offered to fix the roof before winter deepened, a simple act that felt heavier than any vow, and Ayanna accepted with a nod that carried its own gravity. He returned again and again after that, mending boards and bringing food without ceremony, wearing the crocheted sweater into town despite the looks it earned him. Ayanna never thanked him aloud, but her presence changed, easing into the shared work with a calm that felt like trust, and in the evenings they sat near the fire, hands busy, words unnecessary. The world beyond the cabin walls remained uncertain and often unkind, but within that small circle, something resilient took root. Maeve passed quietly when the snow first fell, leaving behind the echo of her lessons and the warmth of what she had built with nothing but patience. In the days that followed, Caleb and Ayanna continued to mend together, the future unwritten but no longer empty, and if the prairie still stretched wide and unforgiving, it no longer felt quite so alone, which was a beginning neither of them had known how to ask for. Winter settled fully after Maeve Redwillow's passing, not with violence but with a quiet certainty, as if the land itself bowed its head in respect. Snow softened the sharp edges of the prairie, and the world learned to move more slowly. Caleb Rourke found himself rising earlier than before, the cabin no longer feeling like a refuge from people but a place waiting to be shared, and that realization startled him each morning like a truth he had tried not to learn. Ayanna remained near the cottonwoods, tending to the small cabin with the same care her mother had shown, though grief sat in her chest like a stone warmed by memory. She did not wail or withdraw. Instead she worked because work had always been her way of loving the living and honoring the dead. Caleb came often, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with nothing but his presence, and they spoke little of Maeve, knowing that what mattered most did not need language. In those silences something steady grew, shaped by mutual respect rather than need. The town noticed the change before either of them named it. Whispers followed Caleb when he wore the crocheted sweater openly, its pattern unmistakably native, its warmth undeniable. Some men laughed under their breath, others looked away, and a few watched with a curiosity sharpened by judgment. Caleb felt the old urge to retreat, to harden himself against opinion, but each time he thought of removing the sweater, he remembered Ayanna's hands, patient and sure, and he left it on, choosing the quiet weight of dignity over the lighter comfort of approval. One evening as the sun bled gold into the snow, Ayanna joined him at his cabin for the first time. She stood at the threshold as if measuring the space, and Caleb realized how many years he had lived without inviting anyone inside. He stepped aside without ceremony and she entered, her gaze taking in the worn table, the mended chair, the fire already lit. It was a small thing, that crossing, but it carried the gravity of trust, and the air between them seemed to hold its breath. They cooked together, movements unpracticed but gentle, sharing a meal that tasted of effort rather than celebration. Caleb listened as Ayanna spoke of her mother's childhood, of resilience passed down like a hidden inheritance, and he found himself sharing pieces of his own past, losses he had wrapped in silence, mistakes he had mistaken for identity. The words felt rough in his mouth and used, but Ayanna listened without interruption, offering no absolution, only presence, which was more than he had known to ask for. As the months turned, they began to plan without calling it planning. Caleb repaired the cottonwood cabin fully, not as a favor but as a shared future made practical. Ayanna continued her work, though now people sought her out with a respect that had once been absent, drawn perhaps by the steadiness she carried or by the sight of Caleb standing nearby without claiming ownership. Their connection remained unspoken, shaped by mornings spent mending and evenings spent watching the light fade, and in that restraint, it deepened, unhurried and sure. The true test came in early spring, when a trader passing through town made his contempt plain, dismissing Ayanna's work and questioning Caleb's choices in a voice meant to be heard. The old Caleb would have turned away, swallowing the insult to keep the peace, but this time he stood still, feeling the weight of the sweater on his shoulders and the weight of Ayanna's gaze beside him. He did not shout or threaten. He simply stated his respect, his voice calm and unwavering, and in that quiet firmness something shifted, not just in the trader but in Caleb himself. Later that night, as rain softened the thawing ground, Ayanna thanked him, not for the defense but for seeing her as she was, whole and capable. Caleb looked at her then, really looked, and understood that love did not arrive like a storm or a declaration. It arrived like this, through shared weather and shared choices. He reached for her hand, hesitant but honest, and when she did not pull away, the world seemed to settle into a shape that finally fit. They did not marry quickly, nor did they speak of forever as if it were guaranteed. Instead they lived into it, day by day, honoring the lessons Maeve had left behind. The sweaters Ayanna crocheted grew more intricate, each pattern telling a story of survival and grace, and Caleb wore them proudly, carrying those stories into places that had once felt close to him. Together they created a life that did not erase hardship but stood beside it, steady and unafraid. Years later, when travelers stopped at the edge of the prairie and asked about the man who lived there and the woman whose hands could mend anything, they were told not of a great romance, but of two people who learned to see each other clearly. And if you listen closely to the wind that moves through the cottonwoods, you might hear the echo of that lesson, that dignity is built in small acts, that love grows best when it is not rushed, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is allow themselves to be changed.